Disney has had many ups and downs over the years that go all the way back to the time of Walt Disney himself. First, it was their golden age from 1937 to 1942, then a weaker period from 1943 to 1949, then their silver age from 1950 to 1967, which led into perhaps their worst time of all from 1967 to 1988, the dark ages of Disney, but which also gave way to the Disney Renaissance that lasted from 1989 to 1999, and then the post-Renaissance from 2000 to 2008, which then gave way to what's known as the Revival Era. Now, how long the Revival Era lasted, and how effective it actually was in reviving the Disney brand, is a subject of much debate among fans of the company. But what isn't a subject of debate is that their 2010 effort, Tangled, is hands down one of the best movies to come out of this time period, to the point that some would even argue that it's actually a bit underrated, and ended up having its thunder stolen by Frozen a few years down the line. And today, I'd like to go over why Tangled is indeed one of the best movies to come out of the more modern era of Disney, and even deserves to be considered something of a masterpiece. And obviously there will be major spoilers ahead, so in case you haven't seen this movie yet but would like to, please do yourself a favor and come back to this video another day. This will be the only spoiler warning I'll be giving out. Okay, so a while back I already did a video heavily praising Tangled as the last true Disney movie to come out of the company before Pixar's influence started getting out of control, and I'll leave a link to that video in the description in case you'd like to check it out. So rather than go over all of that again, this video will be much more about judging Tangled simply based off its own merits as a children's movie and piece of animated entertainment. And speaking of that, one of the first things that must be mentioned is its animation style, because while many have come to dismiss Tangled's visuals in the wake of more stylized CGI animated films, such as the Spider-Verse movies, Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, or even some of Disney's later efforts such as Moana or Frozen 2, Tangled honestly has a look completely all its own when you really stop and analyze it. Sure, it's not as detailed or elaborate as those later movies are, but it's not really about detail or trying to look as realistic as possible, and makes up for those shortcomings with a ton of character. In other words, Tangled's animation style reflects heavily on its inspiration as a storybook fairy tale, and the CGI is designed to give the world it takes place in that kind of feel and personality. It harkens back a lot more to traditionally animated films that greatly relied on how the artists wanted the characters and backgrounds to look, giving everything you see a very distinct and human look to it, rather than the generic look CGI could often leave movies stuck with due to their limitations in technology. And that's exactly what lead animator Glenn Keane was going for. He wanted a traditionally animated movie in CGI to make the computer do what the artists wanted rather than have it dictate what could and couldn't be done. And indeed, when they didn't have the technology required to achieve a lot of the visuals Keane wanted, Disney was forced to create it themselves, as Keane wouldn't settle for anything less than perfection. And while this is evident all throughout the film, perhaps the best example of this is with Rapunzel's hair, as new software had to be developed just to be able to animate that much hair with the amount of flow and personality that Glenn Keane wanted. And once again, while it might seem tame compared to what later CGI movies had to offer, all of these innovations and advancements in technology weren't in vain, as it lends the movie a very human quality that most of those later movies lack. Because while it may have been animated with computers, the effect is much more in line with a traditionally animated film, feeling very warm, cozy, and as if a storybook had truly come to life and was spilling its contents for all to see. Because as I already said, it doesn't go for the overly realistic or excessively stylized approach that many later movies popularized. It's committed to feeling like an illustration of a book told in 3D, and honestly, honestly, the results might just be not only one of the best CGI animated movies I've personally ever seen, but also one that's held up much better over time because it prioritized character, personality, and a distinct visual style over innovation. Seriously, one of the worst mistakes Disney ever made was letting Glenn Keane leave. He was easily one of the best animators the company had since Walt Disney's 9 Old Men, and was largely responsible for making Tangled look as great as it does. But Tangled does still have a lot more to offer than just its beautiful visual style. Because as I even brought up in the aforementioned video, not only does this movie perfectly nail the look and feel of a fairy tale, but it also understands how to tell one at that. Because rather than do what was trendy at the time, it was made and go with a more subversive take on the genre like DreamWorks had been doing. Disney finally decided to start doing what they do best again and unironically adapt a classic fairy tale and put a famous coat of Disney paint on it with all the trimmings. And the results are something that Disney hasn't been able to replicate since, as the temptation to start deconstructing themselves again simply got too overwhelming. But before I start getting into that again, where Tangled particularly excels in this regard is that it knows how to be a movie for both kids and adults like classic Disney famously did. Because if you're a frequent watcher of my channel, you'll know that one of my biggest issues with children's entertainment these days is that it doesn't really feel like most kids' movies are made for kids anymore. Frankly, most animation studios, apart from Illumination, feel like they're catering strictly to adults and only throw a few things in to keep the children interested most of the time, when it should honestly be the other way around. But Tangled doesn't do that, and instead goes the more old school approach by making sure that both camps are happy and will enjoy what they're seeing. Because for one thing, the comedy lands really well. Seriously, this might not be the funniest movie Disney ever made, but when it gets funny, it's downright hilarious. Because it's not relying on lowbrow or juvenile type gags. These are things that anybody will find funny. But where this is perhaps put to the best use is in how it goes about telling its story. Because the story is told simply enough so that children can understand it, but does have more to offer lurking in the background for those wanting more, as adults probably will. But at the same time, if one doesn't pick up on the deeper, darker aspects of the story, that won't hinder their enjoyment at all and can still fully appreciate what it is even when taken completely at face value. And as I spoke about at length in another video, which you can also find a link in the description to, that's another thing that's missing from more modern children's movies. Simplicity. Everything, even stuff made for 5-year-olds, wants to be taken as seriously as the most artistic films ever made, and as a result are way too complex for the demographic they're supposedly trying to appeal to. But Tangled, on the other hand, isn't ashamed to be exactly what it is, which is a Disney adaptation of a classic fairy tale, the simple story of an isolated girl who turns to a charismatic thief in order to achieve her lifelong dream against her guardian's wishes, only to start to fall in love with him as time goes on and realize something about her life isn't quite right. And when you really look at it, there's not much more to the narrative than that. Sure, there is plenty of subtext for those looking for it, but in the end, this is a movie that knows it's being made for children first and foremost and is willing to commit to that. Hence why the world is shown to be a pretty great place to live in, where even scary thugs are revealed to be nice if misunderstood souls, and smiting out the one truly evil person present is all it takes for everybody to live happily ever after. And if that doesn't sum up exactly what an ideal kids movie should look like, then I really don't know what does. That being said, that doesn't mean the darker, more adult parts of the story shouldn't be overlooked either, because whether consciously or not, some children will still pick up on them, and that's part of what makes the movie so great. Because in essence, Disney took the classic fable of Rapunzel and turned it into the story of a woman with an exceptional gift who's isolated from the world by an evil, selfish woman who wants to use her gift exclusively for her own benefit, using psychological manipulation, mental abuse, and gaslighting to keep her firmly under her wing, and is only set free when that gift is taken away from her. Really, that hits a lot closer to home in real life than some people would like to admit. I mean, I'm not one to give real-world commentaries, as I've stressed in many other videos, but seeing Rapunzel confront Gothel after realizing the truth is messed up on so many levels because of how true to life it all is. Especially because when you really look at it, Disney was actually holding back in their depiction of her. Because at least Gothel has a very understandable, tangible reason to keep Rapunzel locked up, even if that doesn't excuse her behavior at all. Most parents equivalent to her in real life don't even have that beyond just being very sick in the head. But going back to the scene in question, just look at how Gothel handles the situation. Because what's easy to miss is that she never outright denies that Rapunzel is the lost princess. She heavily implies that she's wrong, but never actually says it, which reflects how the best people in her line of work, shall we say, often rely on half-truths in order to confuse their victims and be able to spin things to make them see things the way they want them to without technically lying to them. And this is a technique that we also see her use throughout Mother Knows Best. During that song, Gothel uses exaggeration and plausible deniability to make the world and the things she describes about it seem a lot more dangerous and menacing than they actually are, as well as gaslights Rapunzel by hindering all of her attempts to handle the situation she puts her in and chalks it up to her being weak. But while this works like a charm during Mother Knows Best, by the end this technique doesn't work anymore because now Rapunzel has firm evidence that she's been lying to her about everything. So while Rapunzel probably still wouldn't believe her, even if she did outright lie and say she wasn't the princess, what makes her scarier is the fact that she refuses to give Rapunzel the ammunition of being able to say that she outright lied and instead defaults back to half-truths and finally attacking her where it'll hurt most when that doesn't work. And what makes that particularly chilling is that it's twofold. First, she's telling Rapunzel that the only other person she cares about is for all intents and purposes dead to get her to lower her defenses. But what's easier to miss is the way she phrases it. Her exact words are, "Where will you go? He won't be there for you." Do you get the subtext of what she's actually saying? Rapunzel knows she's the lost princess, and Gothel won't outright deny it. But by saying that, she's implying that Rapunzel will be all alone in the world if she leaves her. Again, without actually saying it, she's telling Rapunzel that she's not the lost princess, and because the man she's been relying on without her is about to be hanged, she'll be completely alone and helpless in the world if she leaves. And as I already said, what makes that even more terrifying is that people use techniques like this all the time, and most of the time their victims aren't in as good a position to fight back as Rapunzel is. But that only makes Gothel's next action all the worse when she still won't back down, which is to chain her up and essentially force her into compliance, which many in real life aren't above doing either. To put it simply, if one grew up with a parent like Gothel, or was in a relationship with somebody like her, Tangled suddenly becomes 10 times more uncomfortable to sit through, even considering that this is a Disney movie. Many people who had to suffer at the hands of people like her have even been noted to take extreme satisfaction at her terror and subsequent death because of how well she represents those kinds of people. But it's not like this is even the first time Disney has used somebody like Gothel as the villain of one of their movies, as Cinderella most definitely proves. But just like how that movie ends up sending a very important message about those who have to suffer at the hands of parents like that, as I got into in another video, which you can also find a link in the description to, Tangled also helps show that one doesn't have to become what their tormentor tries to turn them into, as well as that there will always be other people who care about them no matter what they say. And that's what Flynn Rider ultimately proves, because he may be one of the most infamous and wanted thieves in all the land, but in the end he's basically just a scared kid in a grown man's body, longing for some kind of purpose beyond being a meaningless nobody, and finds it with the one girl who was able to see the best in him despite his own protests. And in the end, not only is she able to bring that out in him, but he further proves her right by going so far as to lay down his life so that she can finally be free. But thankfully, since this is a Disney movie, he's still able to turn over a new leaf and fulfill his new purpose in life regardless. And ultimately, that's the last, but perhaps most notable, reason why Tangled is such a great movie. It perfectly nails the romance between Rapunzel and Eugene, because Disney has always been particularly good at stories of characters from two different worlds falling in love despite the odds. And a jaded, world-wise thief and a naive, happy-go-lucky, if slightly neurotic girl are yet another combination that managed to work like a charm, going from extremely uneasy allies to bonding over their shared experiences and trying to avoid the law to falling in love as Rapunzel softens his years of cynicism. Many would argue that there are few romances that Disney has been able to tell so effectively, because despite how truly different they are, you can totally buy that they care deeply for each other and would make a great couple, especially once she and the audience see that Eugene isn't nearly as arrogant, selfish, or apathetic as he lets on. And that's honestly the whole point of the movie in a nutshell. Gothel tells Rapunzel that she's useless without her hair and the world is a terrible place to live in. But not only is that shown to be completely false when Rapunzel is able to bring out the best in everybody she meets without using her hair at all, but the world, represented by Eugene and the ruffians, are shown to be pretty good when somebody gives them a chance. So when Rapunzel finally tells Gothel that she was wrong about the world and her, it feels completely earned and only helps reinforce just how horrible of a person Gothel and people like her truly are. So in the end, there are honestly many different reasons why Tangled is such a well-made movie, even aside from all the Disney aspects to it that it gets right. It's got beautiful animation, is committed to what it is as far as being a children's movie is concerned, considering them to a large degree, and centering the whole plot around that, while also not being afraid to say quite a few things about the world through subtext. And that's really only scratching the surface. I could honestly go on for hours building off of those foundations, but I think I've already made my point, so I'll just leave it at that. Really, perhaps the worst thing about Tangled is the fact that Disney didn't learn much from everything it did so brilliantly and thus didn't apply it to their subsequent movies. Because if they had, the results could have easily been even better than what their current output has to offer. Alright, I think I've gone on about this for long enough. So now why don't you tell me? Do you believe that Tangled is a masterpiece that should be recognized as such for any or all of the reasons I just went over, and maybe even something that I missed? Or do you believe that to call it a masterpiece is a stretch, and that it has the reputation it deserves? Please feel free to let me know in the comments below. And sorry if things got overly heavy in a few places, but that was just something I felt needed to be said, similar to what I went over in the Cinderella video. But if you disagree with me on anything I had to say, that is perfectly okay. You can feel about Tangled and its reputation any way that you'd like, and if you think I had it all wrong, I've got absolutely no issue with that. And thank you all for watching. I greatly appreciate all of it, and I hope to see you all next time.